Okay, hi guys. So today we're going to be talking about the artificial womb called the biobag. Before we talk about artificial wombs though, we have to just define some background terms and background information on natural wombs and a natural pregnancy. So ideally a normal pregnancy would last about 40 weeks or 280 days. But throughout the pregnancy, different complications can arise either within the mother or the baby that lead the baby to be born early or prematurely. This is technically defined at birth at or before 37 weeks, and extreme premature birth is defined as birth at or before 28 weeks. As you can imagine, obviously different complications can arise with premature births. The main problem being just purely survival rates. So every week a baby is born before 30 weeks, their chance of survival drops by 10%. So at 28 weeks, at extreme prematurity, a baby only has an 80% chance of surviving. At 23 weeks, which is the earliest recorded survival of a baby, their chance of surviving is all the way down to 17%, which is really low. Some other complications and issues that can arise. About a quarter of all extreme premature babies are going to face some serious lifetime disability like cerebral palsy or deafness or blindness. About half of all extreme premature babies have some type of more mild or short-term disabilities. Some other complications include medical ones. A main reason for this is that, as I said before, premature babies are born prematurely because of an existing medical problem. So they're already getting surgeries, stuff like that. And also, they're just not as developed as a normal baby carried to term would be, so they're at a higher risk for medical infection and other medical complications. Also, they don't really have a great treatment option for premature babies. So as you can see here, the treatment plan right now is really invasive. And it's kind of hard to see what it says, but it features things like ventilators, IV lines, feeding tubes, which is really invasive, especially for a baby that's going to be under 4 pounds often. So sometimes that's really harsh on the body. Another problem with the system is that sometimes it just doesn't work. So if you think about a premature baby in the womb, for example, if you think about their lungs are used to a completely different system. They're used to breathing, I know it seems kind of weird, but essentially underwater because they're in an amniotic fluid environment. So they're getting their oxygen and their nutrients from an umbilical cord, which is attached to the mother, and the amniotic fluid surrounding them, and the placenta. And then if you were to switch them way too early when their lungs are not developed to gas ventilation with the ventilator system and IV lines and feeding tubes, it might not even work if those organs aren't developed enough. So either this treatment is going to be super invasive or it's just not going to work. So the scientists in my paper realized that there needs to be some type of better system, and they hoped that by creating an artificial womb, something more similar to the way babies are naturally before birth, that they could solve some of these issues. So this leads me into my paper called An Extrauterine System to Physiologically Support the Extreme Premature Lamb. It was done last April at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And again, they wanted to take a completely different approach to treating premature infants. And they did the study with lambs. So they did a couple different experimental trials and changed these 3 main things throughout them. So these are the 3 main focus points we're going to be talking about today. The first is the nutrient pump system. So how are they going to circulate the amniotic fluid, and how are they going to get the nutrients to the actual lamb in the artificial womb? Second, what is the container actually going to look like? Is it going to be open, closed, airtight, or not? And third, how are they actually going to connect the lamb to the system? So if you think about right now, as I said before, lambs and also humans are connected in the womb by an umbilical cord, and that's how they get their nutrients and their oxygen. So they weren't sure if they were going to connect it through the umbilical cord or do something like connection through the carotid artery, which is the main artery in your neck. And they thought they were going to do this because as I said before, right now they are getting their nutrients, or humans are getting their nutrients through the ventilation system directly into the bloodstream. So they wondered if they would switch the connection directly into the bloodstream again into the carotid artery. Maybe that would make the nutrient delivery more direct, but we'll see how that turns out. So these are the initial 2 experimental trials that they did. So the first one, they did an open, essentially an aluminum vat filled with artificial amniotic fluid, and the lamb was inside. And then the second one was similar, but it had a lid. So think about an incubator filled with artificial amniotic fluid. And if you look in the red box, I know it's kind of hard to see back there, it says complications during run. And as you can imagine, if you have an open aluminum vat or a semi-closed aluminum vat, what's going to happen? Well, probably infection. And in fact, that did happen. If you look, you can see bacterial overgrowth, sepsis, which is essentially whole body system failure because of infection. So these are really, really major problems, and they're thinking that it's probably because of the actual design of the container. So that was something that they wanted to switch. Also, you can see that cannula displacement and minor bleeding at cannulation site, and that's just the cord or the tube that's connecting the lambs to the system. And in both of these initial trials, they did it through the carotid artery. But obviously, they're having problems with that too. The actual cord is getting disconnected, or they're having medical complications with it. So they thought about switching it back to the umbilical cord. Also, they did some follow-up trials and found that heart rate, blood pressure, and oxygen delivery to the lambs was actually much better if they switched to an umbilical cord connection. So they quickly switched back to that in the next couple trials. So the final design and the final 2 phases of the study featured an artificial womb called the biobag. And here you can see the 3 points. So the first one is the pump. As you can see, it's completely outside of the biobag. So the artificial amniotic fluid is being circulated from outside the bag. So the only thing connected to the lamb is the umbilical cord. And they actually found a way to preserve part of the natural umbilical cord and connect the artificial cord to that. So really nothing is touching the lamb that's artificial. Again, it's a closed airtight container, and it's connected through the umbilical cord. Here's a short video. It's a little bit easier to see in this, but again, the only thing touching the lamb is that umbilical cord, and that's actually their natural cord. Does anyone have any questions about the actual design of the study so far? Yeah.
Well, were the lambs born prematurely, or were they induced to be born, or were they removed by?
Yeah, they were removed through a C-section.
Okay. So they would normally have probably been lambs that would
carry to term. Yeah.
Okay.
Why did they choose lamb rather than, I don't know, pigs or dogs or?
So it's a great question, actually. The reason that they chose lambs is because they're very developmentally similar to humans, like proportionally. So humans take 280 days for their gestation period, and lambs take 140 days for their gestation period. But the intervals at which their organs mature and the landmarks, I guess, are very similar proportionally. Okay, so they did 2 final trials for the biobag. The first, they did 5 premature lambs that had been in their mother's womb for 105 to 108 days. And then they took 3 lambs that had been in their mother's womb for 115 to 120 days. And each of those 5 and 3 had 28 days in the biobag. And the scientists hoped that they could have actually lasted longer. This was just due to regulation. And again, the age equivalence is pretty much starting at 23 or 24 weeks, respectively, for humans. Yeah.
When they transfer to the biobag, do they ever get their lungs working, or literally you've got to do it so quickly?
Yeah, they said that they got it down to, I'm pretty sure, under 2 minutes.
Really, that to transfer, because right, you can't all of a sudden.
And that's why they did a C-section too.
Yeah.
So it could all be done.
It could all be done. Okay.
Okay, so the first thing that we looked at was body growth. So you can see they're measuring body weight here over the 28-day period. And they're measuring the biobag lambs, which are the black line and the black dots. And they're comparing it to the control lambs, which are the naturally gestating in a natural womb lambs. And as you can see, they're pretty much exactly on track with their natural counterparts, which is really impressive, especially if you think about premature babies, and this goes for premature lambs as well, are usually very underweight. So it's really promising that they can get their weight back up to their naturally born counterparts. Another thing that they looked at, which is also really important, is lung development. So as I said at the beginning, the main problem with the system that we have right now, the ventilation system, is that sometimes it's either too harsh on the body or it just doesn't work because the organs aren't developed enough, specifically with the lungs. So they're comparing lung growth to see if they could get it back to, where a full-term baby or lamb would be at. So they're looking at different lung functions here. They're looking at lung volume, surface area of the lungs, surface density of the lungs, and septal thickness, which is a type of tissue in your lung. And again, they're comparing the black dots, which are the biobag lambs, to their naturally gestating lamb counterparts, which are the control lambs or the gray line. And once again, you can see they're almost exactly on track and hitting almost exactly the same marks as their naturally born and naturally gestating lambs are, which once again is very impressive. That means that their lung functions and the size of their lungs and stuff like that is able to get back to where it would be naturally. The last thing that we're going to look at is brain development. So they looked at the physical size and growth of the brain. Specifically, they were looking at the percent of the body weight and the width of the different parts of the brain, which you can see is the x-axis on the bottom. And once again, they're comparing the experimental biobag lambs, which is the black bar, to the control lambs, which is the gray bar, or the naturally born lambs. And once again, they're hitting exactly where their natural counterparts are, which once again is very impressive and really promising. So, does anyone? So, I'll ask you guys if you can kind of summarize or bring up any points. How have the scientists measured fetal success so far? In other words, how do they know that the biobag is working? What different things are they looking at? Yeah.
The development of like certain organs.
Okay. Yeah.
I was gonna say like lungs is one of the examples.
Yeah.
Like measuring it to like normal ranges.
Yeah. So just to recap, some of the things that they have looked at so far is growth, just like physical size, organ development, like heart and the lungs, the brain, mostly the physical size. They did look at some very, very basic functions that we didn't get to talk about, like activity levels, movement, and like breathing, but that was mostly what it was limited to. And some other medical factors that we didn't get to today, like pH levels, protein levels, stuff like that. Clearly, this is kind of a short list though. There's definitely a lot that I'm thinking about that they probably should have looked at. And I'd ask you guys the same question. Is there anything that you would have liked them, the scientists, to have studied, and is it even possible to study that?
Motor function.
Okay.
Yeah, I was gonna say survival outside the bag, but I know you talked about how it's not regulated.
Well, exactly. So, like Dylan said, I think that they probably should have looked at some more in-depth brain functions besides just like movement. And also, the main thing that I was thinking about is that they probably should have had some long-term data on these lambs past gestation. So they were mainly looking at life inside the biobag, but they didn't really look at life past the biobag. Which brings me into the main issue of the study, is that it wasn't really long-term. As Kathleen said, this is because of a couple reasons. The main one just being regulation. So they didn't say who in the paper was regulating it, but they're not allowed to keep these lambs on a ventilation system or past the biobag for a long time. So even if they could get this long-term data, a lot of times they just can't support the lamb long enough to bring it into its full health, which is really frustrating because if you think about babies right now, they often take months on a system like this to bring them back out of the womb and into the world. So it's kind of frustrating that they are limited to this and they can't have this same opportunity. Second, even if they weren't limited and they didn't have the regulations, they don't even have these resources required to keep the lambs alive for that long. If you think about like a neonatal intensive care unit and these systems right here, they're so advanced and they can support lambs that are, they can support humans that have been born in half the time that they should have and bring them to survival, which is like really impressive. And they just don't have that for lambs, which makes sense because lambs aren't normally born in a hospital setting. But again, in the case of this study, they can't get this long-term data because they can't get the lambs to even survive that long. Third, even if they weren't regulated, even if they did have resources to get this long-term data, would it even be useful? Can we even compare this data to something significant? So the only thing that they really could compare it to is data about lambs' behavior in the wild, because that's the only data that is really available. And is the data from a lamb in a hospital even comparable to a lamb in the wild? And second, is the data from a lamb in a hospital even comparable to human behavior? So especially because we're talking about getting or lowering the rates of disability, can we even compare like behavioral functions and stuff with a lamb to a human? Because obviously they're going to have different things that you would like to measure. So all that being said, the scientists have said that they aim for the first human trial in about 3 years from now, which seems very ambitious to me. The data from the biobag is very promising, as you guys have seen. Pretty much everything was on trend. That the biobag lambs were measuring up to their naturally born counterparts, but I think they need this long-term data.
How long were they measuring? I probably said this, but how long were they looking at the lambs in the biobag for?
They had a 28-day period. And
It was 28 days, and so at the end of 28 days, the lambs were then sacrificed to be able to measure brain development and lung.
Yes, some were. I'm pretty sure they had 1 or 2 that were weaned off of like a ventilator system, which is again nowhere near like the ventilator systems that we have for humans. But even so, once they were weaned off, they can't support them in the hospital. And the others were kept on a ventilator system. They didn't say for how long, but once again, the regulation is going to cut them off after a certain amount of time. So since we are thinking about human usage, I think it's inevitable that we're going to come up with some ethical questions. I have some here, and I'd be happy to hear some of yours. But the number one thing I know a lot of people are thinking about is this research even okay to do on lambs? Because they were using more than 20 lambs for this, and as you saw for the first 10, and really all of them were dying at the end because of the regulation or because the initial trials didn't work. So is that ethical? Second, if we are going to use it in humans, is that okay? Because we can't really get human data unless we try it on humans, so is the risk worth it? Second thing, just an ethical question to think about. It wouldn't necessarily stop the study, but does the biobag count as a medical treatment, or is it a replacement for gestation? So something to think about. And then a lot of controversy around this paper has been that a lot of people have argued that this is pushing the limits on viability. A lot of people have said that these scientists are advocating for taking the lambs or humans out from the womb earlier and earlier, which may make the complications worse, like disability rates and survival rates. The scientists have argued that no, they actually are not trying to push the limits of viability. If a lamb or a human happens to be born prematurely, then they would use the biobag to increase their health and improve their survival rates, but they're not advocating for taking the lamb or a human out earlier than they would normally. So does anyone have any questions or anything else to add to the list of ethical questions? Obviously there are a lot. Yeah.
In terms of human usage, would they be getting people to sacrifice their children, or like
So
just what had happened?
yeah, obviously someone would have to sign up from, you know, like way before the date of like surgery. So it would definitely be with someone with a C-section, as they have done in the trials, for two reasons. One, just because it's easier to take the fetus out and move it to the biobag, get it under that 2 minutes. Second, it has to be something planned. So it could be like a genetic condition within the mother that she knows she can't carry to term, and then you can plan it in advance. But yeah, I was thinking a lot about like who would sign up for this, because it may be very risky.
So they don't know how much the biobag costs compared to
That was another thing I was thinking about, is cost. They didn't, but I'm assuming it's going to be very expensive.
Would they be able to do this if the child was born naturally?
No, it would at least right now it would have to be through C-section. Any other questions or thoughts? Okay. Thank you all for coming, and have a happy winter break. Good luck.